Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a show that everyone should listen to with special guest, Margaret B. Thompson. And she's here today to share with us her new book, Finding Color in the Darkness, Losing My Son to Bipolar Disorder. Now, Margaret's book is a report from the front lines of the battle against mental health disorders. Margaret candidly shares her story of her son, John Fish, who is a bright young boy growing up in an average American town, going to school, playing with his brother, and walking his dogs on the beach every day. But as he gets into adolescence, slowly a dark sky seems to settle over him. So Margaret began her career in New York City at MTV. She married and left MTV to raise her two boys, Tim and John, ultimately finding the calling of her life, teaching. Since the loss of her son John to suicide, she has dedicated herself to educating others about the importance of focusing on mental health as a medical and potentially fatal condition. So let's welcome to the show, Margaret B. Thompson.
Thank you so much for having me.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. My goodness, it's so heartfelt. When I started reading it, I was like, oh my goodness, we have to talk. Why did you decide now was the time to write this book?
Well, it's, after I lost my son, I lost him in 2016 to suicide in November. And I was just, even though I knew that he suffered from bipolar disorder, and I was a French teacher and I could help my students after having gotten my master's in education and studying various mental health illnesses, I still couldn't quite grasp that my son might take it, that he was a suicide risk. I think I knew it inside, but it was so hard to accept that this would happen to my son, and who I'd known as a child to be so full of joy and happiness. But that's part of the mania of bipolar disorder, right? They're so, and they reach out to people, that people are drawn to them when they're in that manic state. And I think as a child, they show more of the jubilation and just this great energy that is contagious to the people around them. But when they enter their teen years, and boys are developmentally about 18 months behind girls. So for boys, it's about age 17. For girls, it's about 15. That's when the problems begin to become obvious. As a child, it might be a temper tantrum occasionally about something that doesn't go right, and they always need structure and directions and guidance. But when they become a teenager and things become more disorganized, and hormones are part of it, that's when it really hits and becomes more clear. But as a parent, I just kept telling myself, because my older son had some problems. I was a divorced mom and saw the anger that my older son had with his father not being present. And so I just thought, this is a normal, developmental part of being a teenager, and he'll grow out of it. And I didn't really accept the fact that even though I'd seen from the doctors when he had his first breakdown at 17, he was taken to a hospital in Boston, and they wanted to admit him to the hospital. And I had been listening to an interview on NPR from an author, Nora Vincent, about this book she wrote called Voluntary Madness. And the book was about, with her publisher's permission, she had herself committed to 3 psychiatric institutions. One was a private institute, institution, a hospital. The next was a private hospital, and the next was a private facility. So although the level of the environment changed, it became more elegant as she, moved into the private facility, but the treatment was always the same. She went in, she said, I heard voices, they took her in, and she was put in with all these other patients that had all different types of diagnoses. Some were violent, some were terrified, and given the same 5 medications, and given the same sort of talk therapy of how do you feel, what are you thinking? And so many people called in during that show, whether they were doctors, nurses, loved ones of people who'd been patients or former patients themselves, and all said, yes, this is how it is. And people would do anything to not go back to that environment, because it was very scary, particularly for the people who were terrified and were only a danger to themselves. And so I didn't let John be hospitalized then. The doctors looked at me as though I was crazy for not letting him be hospitalized because he was considered a danger to himself. But his father had been hospitalized, and I had for bipolar disorder. But he was a narcissist, and John was he was very empathetic. So I couldn't see my son going in there, and he didn't want to take medication, which was his choice. Only 50% of people respond to medication, so that's the other part of it. But I just realized that I thought I saw the paperwork that he was bipolar, that he had suicidal past attempts, which I did not absorb that information, and that he had suicidal ideology. And I thought, no, we just have to get him through this moment, this time, and he'll be fine. And I really thought that he'd grow out of it. And so when he went into a partial hospitalization program, and he seemed to do better. That was a 3-week program. And so I thought it was over with. And then when it would come back, it was like, oh, okay, here we go again. It's like you get the flu. That's what I thought. We treat it and it goes away. But each time he got ill, it became worse. And toward the end, it really, obviously, he became very, very dark and very, I couldn't reach him. Nothing I could say or do would reach him. And I did say to him at one point, if there is anything I can do as your mother to take away your pain and own it, I would do that because no mother wants to see their child suffer. And in some way, I think that gave him a permission to realize, okay, because he knew he couldn't bear it anymore, but it was still so hard to accept that I didn't take time off from work to help him. And I would have if he'd been diagnosed with cancer or any other medical illness. And I had to learn the hard way that mental health is medical health, and that I should have taken the time off, and I should have really listened to him and asked questions that I did not. I just went through the protocols. Okay, he's in a hospital program. It's fine. I'll go to work. And because I felt like as though I had failed him, I needed to do better. And the first step in doing better was to understand what he had been going through, what his struggles were like. So I did a lot of research and I did a lot of reading. And I read books from like William Styron's book, Darkness Visible, the author of Sophie's Choice, about his near suicide and what that was like. And it really put me in the head of somebody who was suicidal. And then I read books from Dr. Edwin Schneidman, who's the founder of suicidology, who talked about constriction, which is what occurs before people become suicidal and things shut down so that they have a distorted sense of themselves and others. And they're not thinking, I shouldn't take my life today because it's Mother's Day or it's my mom's birthday or my dad's birthday. That doesn't occur to them. All they can think of is ending the unbearable pain that they're suffering. And Dr. Schneidman refers to that as a psych ache. It's literally an ache of the psyche. And some people have described it as walking through cement that's drying or being in a burning building and jumping out the window. And that's all they can think of. And so I wanted to understand that, but I also wanted to read a story from a mom, particularly, who had lost a child to suicide, to see a portrait or a story of that child's life and what happened and what they thought they missed and what they could have changed or what I might have done differently. And I couldn't find anything that really satisfied my appetite to know that. So I wrote the book initially to do that, to try and put that out there, but also to help other parents understand what I didn't, to let them know, like, please just don't be the ostrich with your head in the sand. This is a medical condition. If your child had cancer, you would take the time off, you would help them, you would be there for them, you would be their voice. And also to help the people suffering from depression, to let them know, I see you, I hear you, I realize that you do have a medical condition, and this is not you being dramatic. This is not you overreacting. This is a real illness. And I wanted to give those people voice. And I actually did hear from some former students who read the book that said, thank you for seeing that. And I'm giving this book to my mom to read so that she can understand it. So that was really powerful. And so that was why I felt I wanted to write this book. And I do hope it helps people to see this illness for what it is.
You feel that most times people just really don't understand bipolar disorder, even from a young age. And that's why there are so many, maybe issues that come up with it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I think it's hard to see, particularly when you see somebody is so happy. And there was some post I saw on Facebook, Instagram, about Robin Williams, and he was always so happy, and Kate Spade, and full of life, and Anthony Bourdain, how he had this ability to really connect with other people, and all of those describe my son John. And the tagline was, sometimes you need to check on the ones we think are the strongest, because you don't know what pain people have underneath. And sometimes it's the happiest people and the people who are the comedians that are trying to make other people feel better. And they're the ones also who often are most empathetic and helping the person who seems lonely and lost in the room. And so you want to check on those people and really look for the signs of what it might be, because when we go about in our daily lives, we don't think about, when we see somebody who's laughing or the tears of a clown kind of thing, you don't think about the fact that they might be suffering from depression. And we can all suffer from sadness or being depressed about certain incidents. But the difference between being clinically depressed, or as they call it, MDDs, major depressive disorders, those are illnesses that they've shown, there's no blood test for it, as I said, but it's behavioral, but there are MRIs and scans that can show that neurotransmitters in the brain are not highlighted, connecting the left and right side of the brain, so that blood and oxygen is not flowing properly. And so that person can go to bed at night and feel really happy and great, and then in the morning wake up like as though there's a 2-ton weight on them, and they're just engulfed in fog, and nothing around them they're not connected to what people say. If you think of the what was the Snoop, I'm trying to think of the Charlie Brown, the voices that you'd hear, the wah 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 voices that you'd hear from the teacher in that cartoon. But that's sort of what they hear. They don't hear the person speaking or what they're saying. They're not making connections. And so the world around them is just a blur, and they really do go into this deep, dark hole. And that's when it becomes most dangerous. And there are different levels of the depression when it comes and goes. But as people get older, I think their depressive episodes become more dangerous. And there comes a point where people just realize they can't do this anymore. And you see people who are very talented and accomplished. And think of Tommy Raskin's son, Jamie, and other people I've read about who were one guy who was both, I believe, a doctor and a lawyer, and he was 32. And they try and stay busy and try and stay active to try and avoid the illness. But eventually it just becomes exhausting. And that's their only way out. 19% of people with bipolar disorder take their lives, and a lot of people are not ever diagnosed with bipolar disorder, so as it often goes undiagnosed. So it's a big problem, and it's been, in the last 30 years, there's been an increase, so that we now, between the ages of 10 and 34, I believe it is, suicide is the second leading cause of death, and that's terrifying.
Yeah, that's just so heartbreaking to hear that. And I know in your book you talk about depression being the invisible illness. I'd love for you to expand on that for our listeners.
Yeah, it's invisible if we're not looking for it. It can be visible when we're looking for it. And what I mean by that is that, as I said earlier, the people that often are, I'm speaking specifically about bipolar disorder. I'm not familiar with other depressive disorders up close and personal to be able to comment on those. But what you see when people become in a depressed episode, you'll see that there's a change in behavior. So somebody who seems to be the light of the party and is manic, when they become depressed, they might not take care in their appearance. So if they've always, for John, for example, his clothes would match, and he would always shower and look, spiffy. And when he became depressed, he'd throw on old sweatpants and a dark hoodie, and he would smoke more and drink more and take recreational drugs. And he couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep. He would utter words that you couldn't understand what he was saying. Or if you asked him a question, you couldn't understand the response. So I could see these things happening to him, and it was very clear in the end what was happening to him. But I just couldn't accept it because it was too close to home, and I couldn't accept the fact that I was watching my son die. And there's a spot that ran on one of the Facebook sites for pages for parents who've lost a loved one to suicide, and it showed this girl who clearly had cancer and had a kerchief that she was wrapping around her shaved head and looking in the mirror, and her mother standing behind her, and she says something like, "You're not the only one with problems." And then the next scene is her lying on her bed, and her father's shouting at her, "I'm tired of you and your pity parties." And the tagline is something like, "We wouldn't say this to our child if we knew they suffered from depression, and depression is a cancer of the brain. In essence, it's an illness in the brain that causes the brain to not function properly. And that is a very important organ because it controls everything else about us. And you will have physical symptoms." And I know John would have, he'd have a lot of acid reflux. And when he wasn't able to eat because of anxiety, which is a common problem with people with depression, and then he'd suddenly be starving and try and eat something, and he'd take a bite, and he couldn't do it because his stomach couldn't handle it. And the inability to sleep will cause paranoid delusions. So there are physical signs that are quite clear when they get to that stage, but they might be subtle for people. Just with anxiety, somebody tapping their fingers or tapping their foot when they're talking, or rapid speech. And those are signs that we can look for if we know to. But the one thing we can always do, regardless of whether or not we know the person is depressed, is we can just always be kind and check on one another. And we can ask questions how people are feeling, and we can listen and really listen and never judge and never give advice, because giving advice, particularly to somebody who suffers from depression and is going through something that is completely different than what you're going through, is demeaning. But you can say that, I know I had this, it's not your experience, and this is what I did, it worked for me, but you do you, like you have to know what works for you, but I'm here to listen and I'm here to support you, and however I can do that, please let me know. And that's an important piece of it, because you never want to be dismissive or unkind to someone. You don't know if that one thing that you say to them they might be at a breaking point. And if you say something unkind, that can just be the one thing that pushes someone over the edge. That won't be the reason why they take their life, but it's a culmination of things. But usually there's a catalyst, and you don't want to be that catalyst ever. So no matter who you're dealing with, whether it's a loved one or a stranger in the street, always be kind.
Kindness goes such a long way. And it's interesting because I think a lot of times when people think about someone that has bipolar or depression, even any type of mental illness, they think that they're not as intelligent as everyone else. And I'd love for you to share your thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, that's a myth, because they actually, Dr. Schneidman talks about this. I think it's called the Terman study. That was a study of people from the 1920s that were had on the intelligence scale, whatever test they had back then, their sort of IQ test from the age of 5 or 6. They tested very high on the intelligence scale, and they followed these people, this group of maybe 1,500 some people, throughout their lives. And what they realized is in that group, the suicide rate was much higher than people who didn't rate as highly on the intelligence scale. So usually there's no one model fits all, and there are different types of depression, and there are different comorbid factors, such as a lot of people with depression have anxiety or OCD. But there's major depressive disorder with no other particular diagnoses, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder. And then there's, are you gay? Are you bisexual? Are you female? Have you been assaulted? Did you have trauma with a parent or divorce? So there's so many things that can play into whatever type of depression you might have. But an ADHD or being autistic, those are things that can also add to depression. but we don't. So it's hard to pinpoint it to any one thing, and that's why it's complicated. It's not like other types of illnesses that can be more. You can have a sort of a textbook case, if you will, but that's not the case with mental illness. And mental illness has for too long been treated as a textbook case. But usually the intelligence level is higher, and I think that it's because there's more. They see more. They see more of the world's problems, and they experience more of the pain. But there are different types of depression. There are people who, when you go into the psychiatric, whether it's an emergency room or a psychiatric ward, if you're feeling suicidal and you take your loved one in or your loved one goes in, they're asked, are you a danger to yourself or to anyone else? And the people that are a danger to themselves are put in with the danger of people who are a danger to others. And we see those headlines when we know about those people when they go into to FedEx and shoot people and for whatever reason. But those people are put in with people who are only a danger to themselves, which is terrifying for the depressed patient. And that really needs to change, because the suicide rate of people leaving psychiatric units is higher than it would be if they didn't go into a psychiatric unit, because the treatment is just locking them up, essentially, giving them the same meds, the same treatment, hearing people shouting obscenities and throwing things. I was there with my son. He did one night in a psychiatric ward. I'd also been there with my ex-husband, and I saw it's terrifying, because there are so many volatile people in there. And I'm not trying to dismiss their mental illness, but when you have people who are volatile with people who are terrified and frightened to be put in that environment, it makes it worse. So when you know that you have another episode, a depressive episode, the likelihood of you going back to a hospital, if you know that's your only option, leads people actually to take their lives rather than to seek that help. And we simply don't have enough beds for psychiatric care, and we need to treat it better than we have been treating it. And we need to focus on some of the more alternative emerging treatments that are out there and be able to fund those. And fortunately, that's beginning to happen. It's been a slow process, but even after the increase in suicides over the last 30 years, in the last 2 years, there has been a small decrease, but it's beginning. And I have to give a shout out to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, because they've been doing a lot of work, and a lot of their donations go to science-based research and to a lot of programs. And they partnered with other mental health organizations to help get awareness out there, to help pass laws to prevent suicide. And they're a terrific organization, and their goal is to reduce the suicide rate, and they are getting there. So there's good stuff that's happening. It's just slow.
Yeah, some of the stuff just takes time to develop. And, unfortunately, sometimes it takes years. I know that you also are very brave in sharing about how you have walked through the depression, of course, with everything that's happened. How did you walk through all that?
Well, I think it's David Kessler, who's a renowned grief therapist. He has a book called Finding Meaning, the Sixth Stage of Grief. And there's a thing called post-traumatic growth as opposed to post-traumatic stress. And you can either let your grief define you and shut down and wait until, and you might as well be dead. A lot of people are like that, unfortunately, that they decide that their life is over and they are just trying to get through every day. And there are days where, I do feel that way because of having lost a child. And I was so close to him, and it was excruciating. But after the first year is tough because you have the year first, as they call it. The second year is tough because everything becomes very real to you when you've been in sort of a state of shock. But bit by bit, you sort of navigate those waves of grief, as they call them. And you find that you can, even though when they come on, you know that you will get through the other side. And as the years go by, they don't come as often, and they're not as intense when they come. And I try and help other parents, bereaved parents, on these Facebook pages and get in contact with them. And I'm now starting to get involved more with the AFSP's programs for suicide loss survivors, meaning those of us who've lost a loved one to suicide. And it really helps me to be able to help other people. And I couldn't help John, and I failed to do that, but I will make meaning out of my life by honoring his life and helping others who either lost someone to suicide or helping people who are at risk of losing someone to suicide or who themselves are a suicide risk. And just to promote that message. And that makes all the difference. And in a way, it gives more meaning to my life than I had before. And I'm really grateful to be able to look back on my life, and despite of a very difficult divorce, and I lost both parents this past year and a good friend to cancer, I can look back at all the love that I had in my life and be grateful for that, because there are a lot of people who don't ever have that and who go through this life with so very little. And, I could always, books like Viktor Frankl's The Meaning of Life, I think, or Man's Search for Meaning, I forgot the title. But he was in World War II, a prisoner in World War II, and he still found a reason to find joy and happiness in life. And I think that's what we all need to do, even under the worst circumstances. But some people are not as wired as well to do that, and I can't judge them for that, because they themselves can have depression, so their brain is not wired. And I used to think more that happiness was a choice, and for all of us, but it's not. It is for me, and it's more difficult now with having lost all my loved ones. But I still am able to do it, and I'm still able to go to bed at night. If I had a bad day, I can set my intentions for the next day and say, okay, tomorrow I'm going to get up and I'm going to do A, B, C, and I'm going to get this done and that done. But I take great joy in my two dogs. One was my son's dog, and the other one he picked out a rescue dog for me. So they're my constant companions. They provide unconditional love and a lot of joy, and make it a point to get outside every day and enjoy nature and listen to the birds. I'm kind of a nature geek, and exercise, and just to connect with loved ones, and making every moment count, because you know all too well how you might not have those moments in the future. So it's truly important to be able to not take for granted the many blessings you have in your life, and to remember that it's not about the material things, and it's about the connections we have with one another and the love that we share with each other, and to just be appreciative. And when the bad days come, or the dark days, meaning whether it's the weather or it's your mood, to put it in perspective, that allows you to really appreciate the sun when it comes out the day after the storm, whether figuratively or literally. And so that's an important piece.
Well, everyone will get to a point where we're working through grief in one form or another. And a lot of times that really dovetails with depression. So I think having these discussions and allowing people to be more aware of just depression, bipolar disorder, and just mental illness helps them to go, okay, maybe look at themselves when they're going through a really tragic time.
Mm-hmm. It does. And it's also, you're not alone is another AFSP slogan, but it's important that sometimes we feel that way, whether it's because of grief. And for me, I will say sometimes to my friends, there used to be the phone, your 5 fave, I think they call it, or something, but your favorite 5 people that were sort of on your proverbial speed dial, which no longer exists on cell phones, but your favorites. And those, for those people, my parents, my friend, and my son, obviously my son, are gone. So that sometimes can hit you like, wow, I want to call them. I want to talk to them, or something monumental has happened, or I'm feeling down and I want to talk to them and I can't. But it's still knowing that there's a reason why you're here. And I do believe in a divine power. I'm not a religious person, but I am a spiritual person. And I do believe that that we all have reasons why we're here, and we have to do the best with what we have and try and improve the lives of others, while also learning to love ourselves, even in times when we all get down on ourselves, I think, at different times, but we have to remember that we have value. And when you reach out to other people, it's interesting how much that connection means to them, or when they reach out to you, how much it means to you. So it's always thinking about those connections and keeping them alive. But then on the times when you're not in that space, when you do need to be alone, to be able to honor that. And if you feel down, it's okay. You can respect it and respect the darkness, because it will make you appreciate the light even more so.
Well, that certainly does. Margaret, I really appreciate you taking the time to be here and to talk with us, so candidly about your journey and your book, Finding Color in the Darkness. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
Thank you for asking. I'm going to be starting my own podcast soon. It will be to help other people who suffer from depression, or who've dealt with grief, or who have suffered from being considered not equal for whatever reason, whether it's coming from being an immigrant, a person of color. I want to hear people's stories and to share those stories with others, so that others can feel that this resonates with them, or that this is their story, to keep us all connected. And I really believe in finding those connections and making meaning out of life. But the book itself is available on Amazon, and it should be, it's in the process, I believe, of being available on audio, but it's either paperback or Kindle. And and I have an Instagram site, Finding Color in the Darkness, and a Facebook site, Finding Color in the Darkness, and a Gmail, findingcolorinthedarkness.com, at gmail.com.
Well, Margaret, thank you so much for taking the time to be on a show with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Margaret. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Finding Color in the Darkness. Finding Color in the Darkness is available to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And if you don't see it on the shelf, ask for them to order it. And of course, it's available on Kindle. Again, if you'd like to connect with Margaret, you can at Facebook, Finding Color in the Darkness. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.